Is it true that there's documentation on, like literal documentation on how to launch a street uprising?
Oh my God, where do you want me to start? There's an entire field. It's not just like a
That's so
document. I mean,
crazy.
this is democratization studies, international relations 101 now. College kids learn how to do this.
Good Lord.
This is how you, I mean, think about someone like Michael McFaul, who was the U.S. ambassador to Russia. He spent 30 years at Stanford working on the body of work, the playbook on how to do it, the sequencing of events, all the different levers within a society you need to control in order to have it successfully play out. These models are constantly updated for emerging technologies like social media, for emerging laws and counter attempts by a government to resist a color revolution, like NGO transparency laws and the like. It's a huge, huge, huge field, and it started off in the 1950s, right in tandem with the construction of the intelligence apparatus in our country. I mean, really, it all goes back to they all call themselves scholars and academics in order to try to, I always say you can't spell academia without CIA, but the fact is Gene Sharp
This is so
was,
dark.
well, to this day, I mean, Gene Sharp started this work in the 1950s, at a time when the U.S. foreign policy establishment was, in the absolute armpit of the Cold War, and trying to figure out how do we, now that the nature of war has moved into the political realm rather than the kinetic military realm, how do we develop a body of theory to reliably be able to go country by country and develop this political influence apparatus, in order, if we lose an election, what do we do in that event? How do we still have a kind of civil society resistance? How can that take power even if we don't win an election? And so this body of work that is now every major university, and I'm not joking when I say that, whether it's Harvard, Stanford, MIT, Dartmouth, Berkeley, Arizona State University, Florida, there's it is a it is a 101 for getting into this field, that you learn about civil resistance. And it is a big part of what the State Department, what USAID, what the U.S. Agency for Global Media does. But Gene Sharp, I mean, this started as I hesitate to even legitimize it with even the front term of academia, because you have to understand that this is a military, and if you want to extend it, a military statecraft and intelligence world completely. Gene Sharp got $50 million from the Department of War to do the research for this at the Harvard Center for International Affairs. Now, for folks who are following along, I'll just let you play out the acronym for Center for International Affairs in your head. This is like right in your face. I mean, this is the Harvard CIA, which was created by Henry Kissinger, who was the National Security Advisor and Secretary of State, recruited Gene Sharp. They got $50 million from the Department of War, and not just from the Department of War, but from the Psychological Operations Center of it, in order to build the body of work for how groups that were supported by the U.S. State Department could leverage influence of a minority of the population to do bottom up rather than top down revolutions. Because prior to World War II, the way you did coups was primarily through the military. What you would do is the State Department. This is before we had a CIA, but the British would do this. The UK Foreign Office would work with, military generals, or the U.S. War Department would work with military generals, police, security forces, and because the guys with guns had a monopoly on violence, the way to do coups was always top down. You would work with the generals, the police, and then you would simply have a military takeover of the country, and then you would have an interim head of state, and then you would try to kind of roll out democracy in a managed way in these vassal state countries. But as it became apparent that you could actually not just have top-down revolutions, but you could have bottom-up revolutions, it turns out there's something that's effectively the same as a military if you get it big enough, and that's a paramilitary. As the U.S. military paradigm moved into what they called small wars, rather than big World War II style things, the CIA, the State Department, USAID, they were all working with hillside guerrilla groups in Cambodia and Laos and Vietnam, or Chile or Colombia, and what they found is actually, if you get a big enough crowd, it's basically like a military. If the mob is so big that the police can't take it on, or if the police end up shooting someone in the crowd, the mob will just kill the police. They're bigger. They outnumber them. In many respects, in many cases, they're armed, or they've got kind of small arms, or they've got bulldozers or Molotov cocktails, or and a certain quotient of the police or military on their side as well. Then you can do a bottom-up, so-called people-powered revolution. And the magic behind that was essentially winning enough hearts and minds through the media to accuse the democratically elected leader of being illegitimate or corrupt, mixed with cash, essentially these groups being funded to do it through USAID or the State Department, or flow through entities like the National Endowment for Democracy or the U.S. Institute of Peace. But it's an enormous body of work. It's democratization studies, it's civil resistance. It goes by any number of names, but you can get a comfortable job at a U.S. university, any U.S. university, or even law school, teaching that field to young aspiring coup plotters.
Now, have we ever run the coup playbook against ourselves?
Absolutely. There was a group specifically dedicated to do it by a professor in the field who was also number 3 at the Pentagon. It's called the Transition Integrity Project in 2020. Transition is one of these watchwords. Transition means we're going to overthrow your government. Transition, we call it a democratic transition. That is when we don't like the government that's in power, and so we are going to transition it to a new government. And in 2020, a group was set up called the Transition Integrity Project. It was run by Rosa Brooks, who was a very, very high-ranking Pentagon official for the Obama administration. Not to put too fine a point on it, but she wrote a book in 2016 called How Everything Became War and the Military Became Everything.
Whoa.
And basically on her experiences on how the military can take over the civil society space, and all the different examples of how, the military would fund operas in Eastern Europe to influence hearts and minds. And this is, everything, whether it's media, operas, art murals, graffiti, dance festivals. And you see this now. I mean, there's a big scuffle at South by Southwest, I think in 2023 or 2020. Yeah, I think it was 2023. The Pentagon became one of the biggest funders of music festivals like South by Southwest.
Were they doing that to control like what bands, or I don't understand?
Well, essentially, now this has been going on for a very, very long time. Music is, and not to detour too hard into this, but the arts and cultural space is a big part of hearts and minds and culture control. And politics is downstream of culture. This is how you see.
Yes, but are they literally like becoming A&R executives? Like, how does this? Because one thing I want to understand is, okay, this has been used against us then as recently as 2020. This is very recent. So what do they actually do? Like, how much of this is AstroTurf? I hear so many conspiracy theories, and most of it sound like total BS to me. But what was the actual playbook run on us?
Well, so we sort of have 2 open threads right now. One of them is this 2020 Transition Integrity Project. And I want to get deeper into that. To immediately answer kind of like how the playbook works in something like the music industry, I can give you some great specific examples, and I can talk about the general structure of it. I'll give you some specific ones. So every year, we as taxpayers give about $350 million to a group called the National Endowment for Democracy. That funding is from us as taxpayers to the Treasury, to the State Department, to NED, the National Endowment for Democracy. The National Endowment for Democracy was created in 1983 by the Reagan administration as a response to the Democrats in the late 1970s severing many of the powers of the Central Intelligence Agency. When the Church Committee and Pike Committee hearings of 75 and 76 ended up revealing the CIA was manipulating domestic politics in order to stop the left-wing anti-Vietnam War movement, Democrats reacted very heavily against the CIA. They hated the CIA in the late 70s, early 80s. Jimmy Carter rode to power on the back of that scandal. One of the first things he did is he put CIA Director Stansfield Turner in charge of the CIA and immediately fired 30% of the entire operations division of the CIA in a single day. It was called the Halloween Massacre. Then in 1979, the U.S. lost control over Iran with the Iranian Revolution. The national security state blamed that on having a weak CIA who could have stopped that coup from happening in Iran. Ronald Reagan wins the presidency, wants to give the CIA their old powers back, but has a problem, which is that the Democrats controlled Congress at the time. They controlled the House of Representatives. And so through the executive branch, he establishes the National Endowment for Democracy, in the words of its founder, Carl Gershman, who he told, I believe it was the Washington Post in 1986, Democrat groups around the world used to get in trouble when they were seen as being subsidized by the CIA. We have not had the power to do that in a long time. That is why the endowment was created. So literally, you have a direct quote from the founder of the group that they were set up to fund the groups, that it would be too embarrassing to the group or too scandalizing to a group if the money came from the CIA. The idea for the National Endowment for Democracy came from the CIA. It came from William Casey and one of his right-hand man guys, Raymond Green, who had worked in the Propaganda and Disinformation Bureau of the CIA for 30 years, who went on to directly draft the legislation establishing the National Endowment for Democracy. The CIA gets a copy of every single grant the National Endowment for Democracy makes. We don't get any transparency over that. So even though it's an NGO that's supposed to be working overtly on philanthropic work, it's a complete intelligence operation. The Biden State Department actually signed this stealth agreement with NED that every single one of their grants is under a total blanket sensitivity. So it's even more secret than the CIA in the sense that even Tulsi Gabbard can't just demand access to it because technically it's not classified. So it can't just be immediately unclassified. It's got this sensitivity blanket that if any of the oversight organs know, then everyone involved in these programs could die because it would put them at such risk to know they're being sponsored by this group that's effectively more secret than the CIA itself. In fact, the Washington Post in the 1990s, when CIA Director Bob Gates was up for confirmation, the Washington Post wrote an article saying we don't even need to confirm a CIA director this year because we have the National Endowment for Democracy, and it's everything the CIA wants to be and more. Well, they have 4 cores at NED, the way it's structured operationally. They have a Republican branch called the IRI. Basically, everyone who wants to run for president has to go through the IRI. John McCain ran IRI for 25 years. Mitt Romney has been on the board of IRI for 15 years. Marco Rubio won the 2024 Man of the Year for IRI. Trump was the only Republican in the past 25 years who was not on the board or running IRI. And this just goes to show how closely the CIA has effectively vetted presidents. There's a Democrat branch called the NDI. Hunter Biden was on the chairman's the chairman's advisory board of NDI. Make of that what you will. But the chairman of the NDI was Madeleine Albright, who was the Secretary of State. So again, you have this State Department CIA nexus. But the other 2 cores are the Center for International Private Enterprise for the CIA and Chamber of Commerce, and the Solidarity Center for the CIA and unions. They also have a media arm to control media. Ned does. It's called the Center for International Media Assistance. This is yet another one of these CIA control over media vectors. But just to come back to this music thing, we overthrew the government of Bangladesh in 2024. The Biden administration did. There had been a big beef between the Democrats and the prime minister of Bangladesh over a number of issues: military base in the region, petroleum. Hillary Clinton, at one point when she was Secretary of State, threatened to have the IRS go after the prime minister's son who was living in the U.S. But the Biden State Department was losing hearts and minds in Bangladesh. They lost the last two elections, and the State Department had correspondence with the National Endowment for Democracy about what to do about it. After the loss, I believe it was in 2021, 2022, the elections there, the State Department worked with one of their NGO CIA cutouts, the National Endowment for Democracy, about what could be done in Bangladesh, because despite running all this money into the opposition, they still got crushed in the election. And what was proposed was a destabilization campaign instead of trying to win the vote, trying to organize a color revolution to get people in the streets and to destabilize the country in order to essentially break it and induce a crisis. And one of the ways they did that was through funding not just students and universities and all of the different cleavages in Bangladesh society who felt disaffected. For example, Ned, with State Department money, sponsored transgender dance festivals, really went after like the LGBT population, went after
as
women
a way
who felt
to spark division.
Yes, as a way to do street protests and to create an international human rights outcry, as a way to break down society, and so that they wouldn't just have an ordinary vote. It would be chaos. It'd be destabilized. And this is what happens if you can't win an election under stable conditions, induce a crisis, things break, and then there's movement. And then sometimes you can just overthrow the government, like was done in Ukraine and like what was done in Bangladesh. The prime minister had to evacuate the country because, once again, the CIA-backed mobs surrounded the parliament building and then just took power. But within those documents that were produced by the investigative outlet, the Gray Zone, who had a whistleblower at IRI, the Ned Republican branch, it was amazing what turned up. The CIA, through IRI, was funding Bangladesh rap and hip hop groups to sponsor musical and hip hop anthems targeted at young people, unemployed people, disaffected youth, to take to the streets and to sow distrust in the Bangladesh government. In fact, this was in the baseline assessment report of IRI to the State Department. They bragged about this. They had columns for all the different grants and what they were doing. And you can actually go on YouTube and if you run a search on my X account for Bangladesh, you'll see all the documents that the Gray Zone published and that I've highlighted. But the CIA through IRI was reporting to the State Department about the different musical anthems that were being produced with State Department money to get people to take to the streets, to get people to distrust or believe that their government was corrupt. And they were reporting on this, how the lyrics were, quote, designed to get people in the streets and protesting. I believe one of the rappers in this group was also a visiting professor at a USAID-sponsored university. That was one of the launching points for these student protests. But you see the same thing everywhere. This happened in Cuba with something called the San Isidro movement, where USAID sponsored one of the main rap and hip hop groups and had this anthem about blood and wasn't blood and soil. It was like land. It was something that it was a Patria y Vida, I think was the name of it. And then got this, this local rap group played on international radio. And while they were working with the Assistant Secretary for Western Hemisphere, and while they were funded by USAID, But you see this, the Biden State Department set up an entire bureau called the State Department Bureau for Music Diplomacy. Last year, they brought 22 different hip hop and rap musicians from 14 different countries to the State Department for training, for activist training. You have revolution music sponsored by the U.S. State Department, USAID. I think freedombeat.org, I think, is one you can look at, where it's literally just civil resistance movements sponsored by the State Department to sponsor riots and revolutions. And this is a checklist item in the same way that music is. And you'll see this in Miami, where I am. The largest performing arts center is the Adrian Arsh Center. Adrian Arsh is one of the largest financial sponsors of the Atlanta Council, which has 7 CIA directors on its board and gets annual funding every year from the War Department, the State Department, USAID, and the National Endowment for Democracy. Then you get this cultural entombment, by the way. This is a big part of when we overthrew the government of Ukraine in 2014. One of the first things we did with the new vassal government, when Yatsenyuk was installed, not by a vote, installed by Victoria Nuland, and she bragged about this on a hot mic that was caught when she said, F the EU, we're going with Yatsenyuk. Vladimir Klitschko is going to have to sit this one out. We'll make him mayor of Kiev, and he'll have to be satisfied with that. One of the first things that happened was they moved the Ministry of Education, the control for it, out of Ukraine and into this EU credentialing body. And one of the red lines that the State Department, USAID, and NATO set for Zelensky his first month in office, the May 2019 Red Lines memo, was that none of the reforms put in place between 2014 and 2019 about education and culture could be reversed. They banned the Russian language, for example, on any Ukrainian TV. They banned Russian access, Russian-controlled social media accounts and Telegram accounts. They banned the Russian language or any Russian affinity teachings in Ukrainian education. You also see, for example, Randy Weingarten, the head of the American Federation of Teachers, making half a dozen pilgrimages over to Ukraine to work with the teachers unions in Ukraine and effectively create this, so that the kids don't get to have any sort of cultural affinity with the political influence within Ukraine, even though half of the country was Russian ethnic. We're not allowed to speak the language. We're not allowed to have any, cultural glorification of anything Russian, so that their minds were controlled in a way that they would grow up to believe in Ukrainian nationalism and the entire purging of any kind of Russian affinity or any kind of alliance between Russia and Ukraine, which had existed, going back to the Crimean War in the 1800s. I mean, going back forever, but completely purged because the CIA ran a coup in 2014 and they didn't want mean reversion after the Crimea referendum in 2014. But you see this everywhere. And it's full spectrum. It's the media, it's the teachers. In fact, the CIA was busted funding our own teachers unions in the US through something called the Vernon Fund, which the CIA would later confess was a CIA front philanthropy that gave $1 million to the National Education Association. That's the largest teachers union in the country, as well as a CIA proprietary called the World Confederation for Organizations of the Teaching Profession.
Hold on. When was this?
This is in the 1960s, 1966
okay. Jesus,
to 68.
man. Okay, so let me put a bow on this and see if I'm tracking this accurately. So, dear public, if you can hear my voice right now, what Mike Benz has just told us is that the right way to view all of these things is that warfare is no longer kinetic, at least if we can avoid it. The real warfare is soft power. There are people that fully understand the way that we are indoctrinated, whether it's music, education, arts, on and on. And they are finding ways to get money into those places through NGOs and the like, USAID being the most famous right now, of disseminating taxpayer dollars around the globe, under the guise of being philanthropic, but actually being soft power warfare, that these are effectively agents of, you were very careful to say they're not all agents of the government, but certainly what we're talking about right now, that some subset of them are agents of government foreign policy. And they are the one thing that we haven't really pulled in really tightly yet. But this idea of drafting off the policies, you've got these hedge funds that are like, hey, I have economic interests here. And the reason I don't think we've quite pulled that one in yet is you'll say we lost an election or we won an election, but we haven't defined exactly what that means. Like who, the blob, like who's considering it to be a win or a loss? I'm guessing the blob and Trump are sort of diametrically opposed. So would it be as simple as if the blob has won, Trump MAGA ideology has lost and vice versa? Like I get the economic part, but is there like a thing that guides the economic thing? Or is it just like, well, Soros happens to be shorting them today, and so we want them to lose. Oh, he's actually hoping this one will win, so we want them to win. That part I'm not entirely sure like how sort of one for one this is. Like, is this an economic battle where we use useful idiots on the ideological standpoint? Or is this an ideological standpoint that happens to get a lot easier when someone like Larry Fink, who I think of as using social movements as cover for economic gain, where he's like, oh, I'm just going to pull this green blanket on top of my investing strategy, and I just know what policies are going to get yeses, what policies are going to get no. I don't care if it's green or not. I just know green's an effective way for me to make more money. So if you can help us tease that out, whether ideology is driving this, whether economics are driving this, that would be, I think, really helpful.
Yeah, I would say economics. It's easy. There is a weird kind of democracy within the blob in the sense that you do have this big stakeholder soup. And the way foreign policy usually gets made is through a consensus of stakeholders within the kind of high net worth individual family class, the sort of folks who have effectively control over the hedge fund, private equity, big multinational corporation folks, and they all have different interests.